The Dano-Norwegian Army of the Great Northern War. Denmark in 1700. King Frederick IV came to the throne in 1699. He inherited the position of absolute monarch over Denmark, Norway, Iceland, Greenland, the Faroe Islands, and the principalities of Schleswig and Holstein. Denmark also held small territories in India, Africa, and the Caribbean. This gave him a very large amount of rather dispersed territory. He would also inherit a large military force that had expanded from the establishment of Danish absolutism in 1660, with an army of around 14,500, to a force around 34,000 strong in the late 1680s. Denmark was an empire in its own right. Trade and control of the Baltic trade lanes had made it a very wealthy state, and it enjoyed control over a large part of the central northern European continent, ruling over Danes, Norwegians, and Germans. The army was effectively made up from two armies, one Danish and one Norwegian, each with its own distinctive character, though united in purpose. The Danish army was the larger of the two and would be used as an expeditionary force as well as for national defence. The Norwegian army was primarily engaged in defending the long border between Norway and Sweden. The early 1700s would see a number of challenges for the kingdom, chiefly the menace to the south of Holstein-Gottorp and the ever-present hostilities of Sweden, as well as two large expeditionary corps of around two-thirds of the total standing army being sent out to fight alongside the Duke of Marlborough and the Holy Roman Emperor in the War of the Spanish Succession. Recruitment in the Danish army. The Danish army had two principal methods of recruiting soldiers. The first was the practice of enlistment. This would see regiments made up from volunteers, often foreign volunteers, who were recruited by a regiment for service. This was a common practice throughout Europe and would see a colonel ordered to raise a regiment and being given a large sum of money to do so. The colonel then paying for a series of company and recruitment officers who would in turn try to fill out the ranks with volunteers. This method worked well enough, but it was open to corruption and a siphoning of funds. In the Danish army, these enlisted regiments were known as verhuer. In 1700, the majority of the Danish army was recruited in this fashion. The other system in place was a conscription system. These were provincial, sometimes referred to as national units, that would be recruited through the Danish conscription system. This was overseen by the Lord Lieutenant, who would collaborate with local government representatives and the colonels of local regiments. For every 20 acres of land, one man would have to be provided. The idea being that one large farm and a few minor ones would work together to provide this soldier. This would see regiments made up from Danish farmers and peasants, as opposed to enlisted volunteers, often of foreign origin. However, whilst the conscription system was used in a lot of previous conflicts, such as the Scanian War, from 1675 to 1679, records indicate that conscription ceased from the end of this conflict and wouldn't be reintroduced until 1701, on the recommendation of the late Lieutenant General Ferdinand Wilhelm Duke of Württemberg-Neustadt, who died the same year. This would see 7 new regiments of conscripted infantry raised, as well as 2 of conscripted dragoons. Throughout the Great Northern War, new regiments would be raised. The conscription method would see a requirement to balance the need to train soldiers on Sundays and the landowner's requirement for agricultural workers. Recruitment in the Norwegian army. The Norwegian army also used enlisted regiments and conscripted regiments. However, in Norway, the conscripted regiments were much more common than the enlisted ones. The conscript regiments would be subdivided into both active and reserve companies, with the active companies taking part in regular field service, whereas the reserve companies were administratively attached to the regiment but were used for garrison duty. The Norwegian cavalry would see regiments with a mix of companies recruited from enlistment and from conscription. The Norwegian conscription system Funkioniert a little differently from the Danish. The Norwegian population mostly consisted of widely dispersed populations of free peasant farmers. Farms would be assembled in pairs to form an administrative unit called a legd. This pair would provide one recruit for the active companies. 2 legd, made up from 4 farms, would then come together to provide a recruit for the reserve companies. The farms that were owned by the crown, aristocracy, or church would each provide 1 cavalry trooper or dragoon for the active companies, and 4 would come together to provide a horseman for the reserve companies. The active companies would come together to train 4 times a year and were placed under the command of local officials. Norway would also see the raising of two specialist volunteer units in the war. One was a Jaeger unit made up from miners who were exempt from conscription, and another was made up from two companies, one a ski company and another a scout company. These were formed from volunteers already in the army, and these would be partially armed with rifles. Danish infantry. When the Great Northern War began in 1700, the Danish army had 11 enlisted regiments of line infantry. These were the Foot Guards, Queens, Prince Christian, Prince George, Prince Karl, Zeeland, Jutland, Funen, Schachts, Marine, and Oldenburg. Each of these regiments had 3 battalions, except the Marine and Schachts, which had 2, and the Oldenburg, which had only 1. Each battalion had 6 companies of fusiliers, and the 1st battalion in each regiment would have a 7th company consisting of grenadiers. The Foot Guards and the Queen's Regiment had 2 grenadier companies. Each fusilier company consisted of 100 men, and each grenadier company consisted of 110 men. At the outbreak of the war, grenadier companies were detached and assembled into an elite grenadier corps. After the withdrawal from Denmark from the war in 1700, they would rejoin their original regiments in the 1st battalions. By the time hostilities commenced again in 1709, the Grenadier Corps had been reformed. The 7 conscripted regiments raised in 1701 and another in 1704 each contained 3 battalions. Each battalion was made up from 4 fusilier companies to make a total of 12 per regiment. There were no grenadier companies in the enlisted regiments. Instead, each company had 8 individual grenadiers incorporated. In 1701, the following national conscripted regiments were raised: the Aalborg National, East Zealand National, West Zealand National, Funen National, Aarhus National, Viborg National, Ribe National. In 1704, Oldenburg National Regiment was raised. The national regiments started the war with a noticeable lack of training and equipment, being originally intended to be used for garrison duties. However, due to the sheer amount of the Danish army serving in the War of the Spanish Succession, being provided to the British and the Holy Roman Empire, the national regiments would serve alongside enlisted regiments, and apparently quickly became their equals in quality. The forces the Danish army sent to fight in the War of Spanish Succession suffered heavy losses, and as a result, in 1703, they were reformed into 4 Ungarska, Hungarian, regiments. Other regiments would be raised and reformed and amalgamated as the war progressed. There were attempts in 1717 to use Swedish prisoners of war to form a regiment, but they never ended up serving the Danish army. Norwegian infantry. At the outbreak of the Great Northern War, the Norwegian infantry consisted of 2 enlisted regiments. These were the Glidenløve and Hausmanns. There were also 6 national regiments. These were the Akerhus, Småland, Uppland, Vestland, Bergen, and Trondheim. The 2 enlisted regiments each consisted of 8 companies of fusiliers and 1 of grenadiers. There also existed 2 independent companies of enlisted soldiers. The national regiments each consisted of 9 active companies and 3 reserve companies. Each company included 8 grenadiers. In 1701, the 2 Norwegian enlisted regiments were combined into 1. In 1710, the Trondheim regiment was divided into 2 regiments, each consisting of 2 battalions. By 1717, the Norwegian infantry had increased to 1 enlisted regiment and 40 national regiments. Uniform and equipment of the infantry. In the first half of the war, the Danish infantry and the Norwegian infantry were equipped with long grey coats with large cuffs and lining in the regimental colour. There were exceptions to the grey coats, though. The Foot Guards wore yellow coats with red facings and button loops. The Queen's Infantry Regiment wore red coats with yellow facings. Very early in the war, it is suggested that the Prince Karl Regiment had blue coats with red facings, and the Prince George Regiment had blue coats with orange facings. The Grenadier Corps at the start of the war had red coats with blue facings. In 1711, regulations were changed to equip the infantry universally with red coats. This took a long time to implement and initially did not apply to regiments serving under Marlborough and the Holy Roman Emperor. It took until 1716 for the change to become universal. There are references later in the war of Danish troops having multicolored cuffs on their coats. In the early part of the war, breeches and stockings were in the regimental colours, as was the vest under the coat. In 1716, new regulations changed the colour of the breeches, vest and stockings to red, but black versions of the stockings may have been used on campaign. Hats were for the most part the common tricorn hat with white or yellow lining. Drummers may have had a red and white lacing instead. Some Norwegian soldiers instead wore a wide-brimmed hat or a kabud, which was similar to the Swedish Karpus hat. I could not find any information on the colour of the kabud, but it may be similar to the Swedish Karpus in that the main body was the coat colour, mostly grey, whilst the effective facings of the hat were in the regimental colour. This is, however, speculation on my part. The grenadiers wore a wool mitre cap. In the early part of the war, these were in the regimental colour, with an alternate colour for the front plate. I have seen depictions of both black and white here. In the later part of the war, the mitre caps were red, with the front plate in the regimental colour. Neckcloths were worn and seemed to be universally white in the infantry. Officers would commonly wear large wigs and have more decorations in their hats, especially in the form of white plumage along the edges of the tricorn, and for more senior officers, gold-coloured lining. Officers would commonly wear an orange sash to denote rank. Shoes were black leather, with no specially shaped shoes for the left or right foot, instead just a universal shoe design that works on either. Belt equipment was of a natural buff-brown colour and made from leather. This may have been pipe-clad white for parades. The Fusiliers would have a large, black leather cartridge box. The Grenadiers had a small cartridge box with a large grenade box instead hanging from their waist. I have seen depictions of the strap of the grenade box being of a natural leather colour and being in a regimental colour with white lining. I am uncertain which was used, or if both were used at different times, or if both were used with the coloured one being for parade duty only. Danish weaponry was very modern and the soldiers well equipped. Each soldier had a steel-hilted sword and a flintlock musket, pikes and matchlocks having been fully replaced. Muskets at this time still used a wooden ramrod, which could be prone to breaking in the heat of battle. The infantry started the war with plug bayonets, but these were soon replaced with socket bayonets. Danish forces also used a cheval de fray, which they had gained experience with against the Ottomans on the Danube and serving under King William III in Ireland and Flanders. Grenadiers were equipped with grenades that could be made of iron, glass, or clay. Grenadiers in the Guards Grenadier Company may have also been issued with some grenade launchers to further propel grenades. Spontoons and halberds were used by officers and sergeants, though primarily as status symbols. As was common in this period, very light artillery pieces were often attached to battalions. These battalion guns did provide an immediate increase in firepower, but came at a cost in mobility as these guns had to be dragged alongside the marching men. Danish cavalry. The Danish cavalry was divided into heavy horse regiments and dragoon regiments. The German territories of the Danish crown would provide some cuirassier regiments. These would function very much like the Danish horse. Only 3 of the horse regiments were made up from enlisted troops. 2 of these had guard status. In 1703, a 4th regiment, a cuirassier regiment, was raised as an enlisted regiment. The horse regiments would often be equipped with a cuirass, though normally just the front plate. In 1709, the cuirass was standardized across the Danish heavy cavalry. The dragoons were mounted infantry, but would often be used as regular cavalry on the battlefield, though dragoons could still be dismounted to perform the mounted infantry role. 2 dragoon regiments at the start of the war were enlisted regiments. At the outbreak of the Great Northern War, the Danish army had 13 horse regiments and 2 dragoon regiments. These would be supplemented by new regiments and national regiments as the war progressed. The king also had a personal Drabant card made up of 57 chosen men. The horse regiments at the outbreak of the war were as follows: the Life Guard Horse, Horse Guard Regiment, 1st Zealand Horse, 2nd Zealand Horse, 3rd Zealand Horse, 1st Jutland, 2nd Jutland, 3rd Jutland, 4th Jutland, 5th Jutland, and the 1st Funen and 2nd Funen. The dragoon regiments at the outbreak of the war were the Life Guard Dragoons and the Holstein Dragoons. 2 National Dragoon regiments would be raised further into the war, these being the Jutland National Dragoon Regiment and the Zeeland National Dragoon Regiment. In 1703, there was also an Ungarska Dragoon Regiment in Austrian service. This was known as Bülow's Dragoons. There would also be a Cuirassier Regiment in Austrian service. This was the Oldenburg Cuirassiers, and they were also known as an Ungarska Regiment upon its return to Denmark. The German regiments that would be raised from Danish-German territories were the Württemberg Cuirassier, the Oldenburg Ungarska Cuirassier, Brockdorf Cuirassier, Württemberg Uls Dragoon Regiment, and the Ungarska Dragoon Regiment. Danish cavalry regiments all had the same internal organisation of 6 companies, each of 67 men at wartime strength. In the Life Guard Dragoon Regiment, one of the companies was made up of horse grenadiers. In the other dragoon regiments, every company incorporated 6 individual grenadiers. Norwegian cavalry. In 1700, the Norwegian cavalry consisted of 1 enlisted horse regiment, Seehersted, and 1 national dragoon regiment, Folkesam. The Folkesam dragoons contained both enlisted and national companies. A 3rd national dragoon regiment existed on paper, named the Nordenfeld Dragoons. In 1701, 3 more Norwegian national dragoon regiments were raised. 2 of these were converted to horse regiments in 1709, and a 3rd in 1710. Some sources indicate that the Seehersted horse was converted into a dragoon regiment in 1710. In 1700, the Seehersted horse was made up of 8 companies, and the Folkesam dragoons had 4 enlisted companies and 6 national companies. The dragoon regiments later raised would also contain a mix of enlisted and national companies, the exact mixture changing per regiment. In 1719, the system was overhauled, and all dragoon regiments would consist of 8 national companies deployed in 4 squadrons. The enlisted companies were detached and assembled into a new enlisted dragoon regiment. Uniform and equipment of the cavalry. The primary colour for Danish and Norwegian cavalry coats in the early phase of the war was grey, with large cuffs in the regimental colour. The 1711 change to red happened for the cavalry exactly as for the infantry, with the change happening only slowly and taking about 4 years to be completed. Very early in the war, some horse regiments still wore buff coats. Exceptions to the early war grey coats did exist. The Life Guards had a red coat with yellow facings, and the Horse Guards a red coat with blue facings. The Life Guard Dragoons and the Holstein Dragoons both wore red coats with yellow and green facings respectively. The Norwegian Folkesam Dragoons had blue coats with white facings. Tricorn hats were worn across the cavalry with white trimming. It is possible the 1st Jutland Horse Regiment retained black lobster-style helmets. Black neckcloths were worn by the cavalry. Breeches and vests were a buff colour. The Horse Regiment had, upon standardisation in 1709, a black cuirass with a front and back plate. The saddlecloths were red with lining in the regimental colour. With the introduction of multicoloured cuffs to the regiments late in the war, the last colour on the cuffs would be used for the lining of the saddlecloths. Horse equipment was black leather. Horse regiments were equipped with a large sword, a pair of pistols, and a carbine. The dragoon regiments were equipped with a sword, a pair of pistols, and a musket. Artillery. The Danish artillery in the Great Northern War consisted of 2 regiments. The Danish artillery with 6 field companies and siege and logistic elements attached. One of these 6 companies was an arsenal company. The Holstein artillery with 6 companies and a siege and logistic element also attached was a company of petardiers and a single Oldenburg field artillery company. The petardiers had petards, which were a type of shaped charge on a pole or set of poles designed to breach large doors and other such targets. The Norwegian artillery regiment had 7 companies. Each company was assigned to defend one of Norway's major fortresses. The uniform of the Danish artillery changed throughout the war, starting at the outbreak of the war with violet coats and green cuffs. They then adopted a blue coat with red cuffs. After the 1711 regulation change, a red coat with violet cuffs was adopted. The Norwegian artillery wore a grey coat with red cuffs. These may have also been exchanged for red coats after 1711. Danish or Norwegian artillery uniform also consisted of a black tricorn hat with white trimmings, red breeches and stockings, a white neckcloth, and black leather shoes. Belt equipment was of a natural buff-brown colour. Artillery pieces were made of mainly bronze with wooden carriages. The carriages were painted red, and the metals either bronze or black. The Danish artillery used field guns, siege guns, howitzers, and mortars. The Norwegian artillery, being used solely for fortress defence, presumably used a variety of fortress guns of varying calibre. Common types of field artillery include 12-pounder, 6-pounder, 4-pounder. Infantry battalion guns were often small 3-pounders. Colours and ensigns. In 1700, each company in a regiment had its own colour. However, by the time Denmark re-entered the war in 1709, this had been reduced to just 2 per battalion. Infantry colours were around 5 feet square and did not feature a border. Regimental colours came in a series of unique colours and designs, often featuring symbols and motifs relevant to the recruiting ground of the national regiments. Horse standards were smaller squares with unique designs per regiment and a fringe. Dragoon standards were similar but thinner with a swallowtail design. Tactics. The Dano-Norwegian army was well experienced by the time of the Great Northern War, having seen service in Ireland, Flanders, and the Danube. After peace with Sweden in 1700, the Danish army gained more experience fighting in the War of the Spanish Succession, so that by the time Denmark re-entered the war in 1709, after the Swedish defeat at Poltava, the military machine was experienced and well tested. The Danish army fought in a largely typical way for a Western army. Here it had gained most of its experience. In battles such as Helsingborg and Gardebusch, the Danish army deployed with the infantry in supporting lines in the centre and cavalry on the flanks. Artillery would be massed in 1 or 2 larger batteries covering important fields of fire. The Danish army often found itself fighting very defensive battles, though this was fairly typical in the Great Northern War, as Sweden's opponents were caught flat-footed by the aggressive and unpredictable Swedish army. Some regiments seem to perform better than others, as is the norm, with the Foot Guards and the Queens distinguishing themselves at the defeat of Helsingborg alongside the Grenadier Corps. The Danish cavalry was trained to advance at the trot in 3 ranks, the front rank with carbines or pistols, and the following 2 with swords. They would fire into the enemy ranks and charge. Whilst more effective than the slower Karakolle tactics, the Danish cavalry would still find itself bested by the numerous and aggressive Swedish cavalry on a regular basis. The Norwegian army performed a much more defensive role, often fighting from fortifications and fortresses. They performed well in this role, blunting the Swedish invasion of 1716, but struggling to organise their own planned offensive earlier in 1710. The Norwegian army engaged in regular patrols and raiding across the long Norwegian-Swedish border, and here employed some innovative light infantry tactics with specialised all-volunteer scout and ski companies armed partially with rifles. These proved very successful troops and tactics in small-scale skirmishing of patrolling and raiding. Conclusions. The Danish army was a unique and multifaceted force that proved very effective for the Dano-Norwegian state. It was able to operate simultaneously across multiple theatres and in general give good account for itself in each. There were some promising signs of innovation in recruitment techniques and specialised units used in Norway. Denmark was badly defeated and forced out of the war early in 1700 by a surprising and rapid Swedish invasion led by Karl XII that threatened Copenhagen, whilst the bulk of the army was absent south conducting operations in Holstein. During service against France, Denmark suffered heavy casualties, but in general gave a good account for itself. On re-entering the war in 1709, Denmark saw mixed fortunes. The invasion of Sweden was thoroughly defeated by a scratch-built Swedish army. It was unable to successfully invade Sweden from Norway, but equally it could prevent Sweden from invading Norway. In northern Germany, Denmark would see defeats, such as Gardebusch, but also success, such as part of the coalition force at Rügen. The Dano-Norwegian army was a unique force in the early 18th century that could very well hold its own as a major player. It struggled going toe-to-toe with the Swedes, but it did form a vital part of the coalition that brought the Swedish Empire crashing down. Sources used in this video were the Great Northern War Compendium, volumes 1 and 2, especially the section on the Dano-Norwegian army written by Kjeld Hald Galster. Armies of the Great Northern War, 1700 to 1720, by Gabreile Esposito, and Charles XII and the Collapse of the Swedish Empire by R. Nibet Bain. This was another video in the series Armies and Forces of the Early 18th Century by yet another history channel. I hope that you enjoyed it, and if you did, feel free to show support for the channel through liking and subscribing, and please do share any opinions in the comments section, positive or negative are all welcomed, as well as any suggestions for future videos.